Tactical aviation, the use of aircraft to support an army locked in combat on the ground, dates back to the First World War. Through much of the fighting on the Western Front, aircraft supported the ground troops by providing much-needed reconnaissance information. Later in the war, as the stalemate in the trenches continued, both sides started attacking each other's troops with machine gun-wielding aircraft. Others carried light bombs to rain down on trench positions. Once the war ended, both the British and American air advocates quickly forgot about tactical aviation as they sought to find an independent role for their air services. As the B-17 became the primary Army Air Corps weapon, tactical aviation in the United States continued to languish. Light and medium bombers were built for the role, but the Air Corps decided they would be used not in frontline attacks, but rather to hit enemy airfields and lines of communication. Chief among these medium bombers was the B-26 Marauder.
The B-26 was made according to specifications to fly at a relatively high speed, carry a heavy bomb load, and deliver the bombs. And safety was a added factor that came in as time permitted. But a great airplane. Once you got 100 hours in it, then you didn't want to get out of it.
Along with the B-26, the North American B-25 would serve as a solid, steady stablemate. While not as fast as the Marauder, it was eminently adaptable.
B-25 was a real nice airplane to fly. It was kind of you bounce around a lot because it was very rigid, and it had big propellers, and the propeller on both sides, they're only about that far from your window. So you had a lot of noise. It was a real noisy airplane. But we really enjoyed flying because it was very maneuverable, and just a fun airplane.
The medium bombers that the United States Army Air Force developed were really designed to placate the Army in its need for close support operations. And since the Air Force really had a thing against actual battlefield air support, what they designed the bombers to do was to attack immediately behind the lines and suppress enemy supply and communication lines. And that was known as interdiction missions. The British also developed a line of aircraft to do the same thing. And in 1940 in France, this concept was put to the test for the first time. And the Allied doctrine was probably sound, but the British certainly couldn't execute it because they didn't have the quality of aircraft needed to do the job or the numbers. They were overwhelmed by the Luftwaffe.
But if British tactical aviation failed during the Battle of France, it would come into its own through hard-won lessons in the desert only months later.
The Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel got deployed into Libya and immediately undertook an offensive against the British. And this offensive was wildly successful, and out of sheer desperation, the British fighter pilots in the area began supporting their army through strafing attacks. Using their fighter aircraft as strafing platforms, they went after vehicle convoys and troop concentrations, and this proved to be wildly successful. And it was the first time, really, in an Allied air service or air force that close air support was actually undertaken on a large scale. For this to be actually integrated into doctrine, however, would require some major changes in RAF thought and the overcoming of many preconceptions.
The major preconception that had to be overcome concerned the RAF's beloved Hurricanes. The Hawker Hurricane had entered service in the mid-1930s as the most modern British fighter aircraft. Capable of speeds over 300 miles per hour, the Hurricane was a pilot's plane, fast for its day, incredibly nimble, rugged, and fairly easy to fly. According to RAF doctrine, fighters like the Hurricane were to be used as air-to-air weapons only. Fighters were supposed to shoot down other enemy planes, nothing more. But in the desert in 1940 and early 1941, Hurricane pilots began to strafe ground targets. Armed with 8 .30 caliber machine guns, these attacks turned out to be devastatingly successful against Axis troop and truck convoys. By the middle of 1941, the RAF in the desert had refined ground strafing to the point where whole fighter squadrons were dedicated to such operations. Equipped with Hurricanes or American-built Curtiss P-40B Tomahawks, these units scoured the front lines and the immediate rear areas, looking for anything to attack. Meanwhile, light bomber squadrons equipped with Lend-Lease Douglas A-20s and Martin Marylands pounded the Africa Corps supply centers, airfields, ports, and tank loggers with bombs. In 1942, the American Army Air Force entered the Desert War. Several fighter and bombardment groups reached Egypt, where they served in support of Montgomery's 8th Army. When the Anglo-American invasion of Morocco and Algeria took place on November 8, 1942, the Army Air Force went into widespread action against German forces for the first time. Far from a strategic air war the service spent the interwar years preparing to fight, the Desert Air Campaign was almost entirely tactical in its nature. Without factories to bomb, the American air units were forced to learn the tough and dirty work of supporting an army in battle. American medium and light bombers went into action against Axis airfields around Tunis, hit troop concentrations and vital road junctions. Bridges were also hit as the Army Air Force embarked on its first widespread interdiction campaign in its short history. Meanwhile, the fighter units were also getting into the act. Convoy strafing became a specialty for groups such as Colonel Reynard's 79th.
And a straight-out strafing, we were right down on the deck. Right on the deck, I mean on the deck. Those were the most costly missions. We lost most of our people in strafing. The Africa Corps was extremely disciplined outfit, and anytime we attacked them strafing, they didn't just hide or run. They turned around and fought back. They were shooting at us all the time, throwing rocks if nothing else. Literally, it was one of the more dangerous things we did.
If the Americans and British learned the craft of Attack.Air in the desert, they refined it to an art form during the 1943-44 Italian campaign. P-47s roamed across German lines of communication, blasting bridges to pieces with 1,000-pound bombs or shooting up truck convoys, columns of troops, and trains.
We strafed a lot of trains. And what we always did, if we strafed a train, number one, hit the engine. The next people started hitting in different spots and shooting from a distance, because if they're filled with ammunition or any kind of explosive, you can